Right. So we've been discussing about the five-step model. So today we have to continue from the step 4. So far we have discussed about 3 steps. The first step, from just to go back to the model. So first we identify the contract with the customer. Then the performance obligation that is there in the contract was identified. So that is the promised goods or services, the promised goods and services. And in the third step, we have determined the transaction price considering all the performance obligation. Now it's time to allocate this transaction price among the performance obligation. We'll see. Allocate the transaction price to the performance obligation in the contract. Allocate the transaction price to each performance obligation in an amount that depicts the amount of consideration to which the entity expects to be entitled in exchange for transferring the promised goods or services to the customer. You know, when it comes to the performance obligation, so those are nothing but the promised goods and services. So when it comes to the performance obligation, it is satisfied at different points in time. So if I get back to the kind of basic example what you had, so there you have seen that uh, the Dockyard PLC had sold the ship together with the maintenance contract. So when it comes to the ship would be immediately delivered. But when it comes to the maintenance, it is performed in 1 year's time. So therefore, this performance obligation would be satisfied in different point in time. So therefore, it is pretty much needed to allocate this total consideration among the performance obligation, because you have to recognize the revenue uh, when and where you perform the kind of when and where you satisfy the performance obligation. If you have one performance obligation exists in the contract, you can allocate the transaction price straight away to that particular performance obligation. You would find that there could be some basic transaction where there is one performance obligation. So maybe to provide a particular good, or maybe to provide a particular service. So in that, it's straightforward. You need to allocate the whole transaction price to that particular performance obligation. But in contrast, so most of the time what you would find that many performance obligation exist. In that, allocate the transaction price to the performance obligation in the contract by reference to their relative standalone selling prices. Considering their standalone prices, you need to allocate this transaction price among the performance obligation. You know, there can be instances where when you sell a kind of product or services as a package, so there it comprises several goods or services. So in that, you can find that in some instances, these goods and services would be sold um, in isolation. So if you can remember the examples what we had earlier, uh, this situation. In that activity 12.2, we discussed that there's a particular entity that would sell the contract to the customers, where they would sell this kind of goods and services as a package. But when it comes to their business practices, even they would provide these goods and services on a standalone basis as well. Accordingly, you can identify the price for the package as well as the prices for standalone prices for the individual products and services. In such an instance, you can use these standalone prices to allocate the total consideration among each of these products and services. So that is the requirement. So that's what we do when we have kind of standalone selling prices. If a standalone selling price is not directly observable an entity will need to estimate that. But there can be instances where the standalone selling prices are not directly available. So in that particular instance, you may have to use the estimates and you need to estimate that particular price. So මෙතන අපි කතා කරන්නේ fourth step එක. ඒතර fourth step එකේ කියනවා අපි දැන් යම්කිසි contract එක තියෙන සියලුම performance obligation consider කරලා අපි set කරා consideration එක. ඊට පස්සේ අපිට තියෙන්නේ මොකක්ද මේ consideration එක අපි allocate කරන්න ඕනේ each performance obligation අතර. හේතුව තමයි performance obligation අපි satisfy කරන්නේ different point in time. නිසා revenue එක recognize කරන්නේ different points වල. When and where you satisfy the performance obligation, you are eligible to recognize the revenue. So therefore, it is a must to allocate this total purchase consideration among the performance obligation. එතකොට අපි කොහොමද total consideration එක මේ එක් performance obligation එකට එහෙම නැත්නම් එක් good එකට service එකට කොහොමද අපි allocate කරන්නේ? එතකොට ඒක අපි කරන්නේ අපි දන්නවා මේ බාණ්ඩ හා සේවා standalone price එකක් තියෙනවා. ඒක ගොඩක් වෙලාවට අපි package එකක් විදිහට බාණ්ඩ sell කරනවා. ඒ වගේම ව්‍යාපාරයක් තනි බාණ්ඩේ විදිහට sell කරනවා වෙන්න පුළුවන්. උදාහරණයක් විදිහට software එක වෙනම විකුණනවා. Services අපි කියමු updates වෙනම දෙනවා. Maintenance වෙනම කරනවා. ඒ වගේ services standalone basis එකට provide කරනවා. එහෙනම් standalone basis එකට provide කරනවා නම් එතන තියෙනවා standalone selling prices for each and every good and service. So by using that, considering the total purchase consideration, you can simply allocate that among the performance obligation. Let's look at that through an example. See, the Wave PLC agreed to a purchase consideration of rupees 120,000 with a customer, and that particular amount you have received in advance. The relative standalone selling price of performance obligation are as follows. You have the performance obligation, the standalone selling prices are there. The above performance obligation will be satisfied at different points in time. So you can see that the performance obligation are satisfied at different points in time. Then the requirement explain how Wave PLC recognizes its revenue. You need to explain how the Wave PLC recognizes its revenue. So decide that. Now you have the total consideration. You might need to allocate that among the performance obligation. In that, the standalone selling prices are given. Yes, here the story is pretty much straightforward, isn't it? So you are given the total purchase consideration. Since the performance obligation are satisfied at different point in time, you would require to allocate this total consideration among the performance obligation. In that, what would be the reasonable basis? Would be the standalone selling prices. And look at the standalone selling prices. 60,000 for software license, 20,000 for installation, software updates 10,000, technical support for 2 years 30,000. So therefore, if you take the total, you can see that it's 120,000 is there. No, it's not that. So how you do that? out of this 120,000, what you had received, you can recognize 60,000 to the software license. 60,000 you must recognize. So initially you recognize the entire amount as a kind of advance. That's what the question says. So if I want to take this to an Excel sheet and just to show you. So this is a pretty straightforward story that is there. You need to just get that. Right. So here the question says that you have recognized, you have received something in advance. So therefore, upon the receipt, how you would have treated that? You would have debit cash 120,000. So අපිට මේක prepayment එකක් විදියට හම්බෙලා තියෙන්නේ. එතකොට අපි advance amount එක අඳුන ගන්න පුළුවන්. Prepaid revenue. Yes, it's prepaid revenue. නැත්නම් revenue received in advance. විදියට අපි ගන්නවා. Right? එතකොට අපිට තියෙනවා 120,000. මේක තමයි initially අපි අඳුන ගන්න ආකාරයේ receipt එක. ඊට පස්සේ අපිට පුළුවන් මේ ආදායම එක් performance obligation එක satisfy කරන point එකේ recognize කරන්න. So soon after delivering the software license, out of this you can recognize how much. You can take it out from the prepaid revenue, 60,000. That is the total consideration, and take that to your revenue. It's revenue, software license. It's revenue, software license. Then you have installation service. Once you perform the installation service, another 20,000 can be taken out from this prepaid revenue. Take 20,000 out, and that is your revenue from installation service. Revenue installation service. Then you have the software update. Another 10,000 can be taken out from the prepaid revenue. 10,000, and you can take revenue software update. It's 10,000. Similarly, you have this technical support 30,000, but be conscious it is for the 2 years. So therefore, we recognize the revenue on an annual basis. So therefore, out of during the first year, what you should do, let's say that the service revenue is recognized on the kind of straight line basis. So therefore, you would take prepaid revenue out of 30,000, 15,000, and 15,000 in the first year as your revenue. Revenue comes from technical support services. So that's how you do. Then you can see that if you consider the situation at the end of the year, at the end of the first year, you can see that 15,000 is left in the prepaid revenue account. So it's a kind of liability at the end of the year. Then in the second year, you can recognize, once you provide the technical service for the next year, you can recognize in the next year, you can take the amounts out from the prepaid revenue, the remaining 15,000, take it out and take that to the revenue. So that's what you do. So this would be in year 2. Year 2, all what we did earlier, that is for year 1. See whether you are getting this. Make a පැහැදිලිද? එතකොට බොහොම සරල කාරණාවක් තිබ්බේ අපි standalone prices බලුවා. Standalone price කියන අපි මේවා වෙන වෙනම වික්කොත් කීයකටද දෙන්නේ කියලා. එතකොට මෙතන පොඩ්ඩක් realistic ගතිය අඩුයි. මොකද අපි සාමාන්‍යයෙන් පැකේජ් එකක් විදිහට විකුණනවා නම් තනි තනිව විකුණනවට වඩා අඩු මුදලකට තමයි සාමාන්‍යයෙන් විකුණන්නේ නේ. ඒකට තනි තනිව විකුණන ගානම හරියටම පැකේජ් එකට කියලා charge කරනවා කියලා දැන් අමාරු. ඒ නිසා රියලිස්ටික් ගතිය අඩුයි. So ඉස්සරහට අපි කතා කරනවා discount scenario එකක්. නමුත් just to understand the concept, if you have the total consideration for all the performance obligation, so if you have the standalone prices for each of these performance obligation, when using that, you can allocate the total consideration among the performance obligation, different performance obligation. The reason is that the performance obligation are satisfied at different point in time. So I would like to hear you. Is that clear? Are you getting that? So if anything that you are not comfortable with, so please let me know. Then I would be able to further explain that, right? Right. Okay, good. Thanks. Let's move on. The answer would have provided. Yeah, this is it. Each performance obligation is distinct and it required to account for each performance obligation separately. Software license recognize 60,000 when the obligation is satisfied. Installation service 20,000 when the performance obligation satisfied. Software update when the performance obligation satisfied. So when come to the kind of technical support, it should be recognized over 2 years time. So 15,000 for the first year at the end of year 1 and another 15,000 that at the end of year 2. Assume that the time value of money is immaterial in case of services. Right. Now, as I told you that it is highly unlikely that when you are purchasing a kind of package, you may not be charged the simple summation of the individual prices of the performance obligation. But maybe you would be offered that at a kind of discount. So this is the realistic scenario. Sometimes the transaction price may include a discount. Any overall discount is allocated between the performance obligation on a relative standalone selling price basis. So if you have a kind of discount scenario, what you have to do is you must first identify the discount and you need to allocate that particular discount among the performance obligation. Say that the question that say that the package is sold at rupees 100,000, then the standalone prices goes as 120,000 while the package is sold at 100,000. Then you can see that 20,000 discount is there. That 20,000 discount, how you are going to allocate that considering the standalone prices. Standalone prices of this individual performance obligation. So you need to allocate that among the performance obligation. Any overall discount is allocated between the performance obligation on a relative standalone selling price basis. We call it proportionate allocation. So like you did in the case of impairment, so that's what we do. Unless any other basis provide reliable allocation of discount, unless otherwise suggested, so we are simply going by the proportionate allocation. Yes, we have that. The way we agreed to a total consideration of 100,000 with the customer received in advance relative standalone selling prices of the performance obligation are as follows. The same question, the only modification is we take here the total consideration as 100,000. While the standalone prices, if you take the total, you can see that it is 120,000. Now the requirement, calculate the total discount amount of the transaction and allocate the consideration among the performance obligation. Now you need to allocate this performance obligation, this consideration among the performance obligation in order to recognize the revenue. So how do you do that? You first take the standalone selling prices, then allocate the discount among the performance obligation, then the net amount what you get, and that is your value of each of these performance obligation that you should consider in recognizing revenue. Right. Give it a try. Take 2-3 minutes and give it a try. Minute දෙක තුනක් අරගෙන attempt එකක් කරන්න පුතාලා බලන්න. Right. Okay. So let's see that. So the same information, you can see that the only difference is that the price is 100,000. So if I want to take that, the first you need to decide what is the discount. So the discount is what? The discount is equal to the kind of standalone total of the standalone prices, total of standalone standalone prices minus the consideration of the contract. Of the contract. So you can see that if you take the total of the standalone prices, it comes as 120,000, while the consideration of the contract, that is 100,000. Consequently, it is 20,000. The discount is 20,000. Then what you need to do, you need to allocate that among the individual performance obligation, because you cannot take the standalone prices for the revenue recognition because it is clearly 120,000. So all what you receive is 100,000. So therefore, 100,000 is what you should allocate among the individual performance obligation. It's 120,000. So here, how you allocate that? This discount, it says that you need to take the pro rata basis. So what is the pro rata basis? If you come to the first, it is 60,000 multiplied by, sorry, it is 20,000. That is the discount multiplied by pro rata, the proportionate basis, 60,000 divided by 120,000. So out of the 20,000 discount, you allocate 10,000 allocation of discount. First you need to allocate that. Then you have installation service, that is discount 20,000, that is multiplied by 20,000. Yes, value is 20,000. 20,000 divided by 120,000. It's 3,333. Then you have 10,000. It is multiplied by, sorry, discount is 20,000. It's always 20,000 multiplied by 10,000 divided by 120,000. Then you have 30,000 multiplied by, sorry, discount 20,000 multiplied by 30,000 divided by 120,000. So there it comes 5,000. Now you can see, once you do this, the proportionate basis, the entire discount you have allocated. If you take the total, you can see that that is 20,000. Now you can simply take the value of the performance obligation. It's simply take the standalone price and deduct the allocation, and then you get the price of each performance obligation. You can see that now you have divided among the performance obligation the 100,000. This is the price of performance obligation. The price of performance obligation. So this is what you should use in identifying the revenue. For example, the first, for the software license, you would recognize, initially you would recognize the entire amount as usual cash, 120,000, prepaid revenue, it's 120,000, sorry, it's 100,000 this time, not 120, because you receive 100,000, and that's what you allocate. So in allocating, you can use the same entries for the first year and for the second year, but the amount would be different. You can update the amounts. It's not 60,000 this time, it is 50,000 revenue from the software license, 50,000. Then you have prepaid revenue. You take installation service 16,667, installation service 16,667. Take the updated amount. Then you have software update. It's 8,333, 8,333. Then you have 25,000 technical service. Once you divide it by 2, 12,500 per annum. 12,500, 12,500. That's it. So it is exactly the similar to what you did earlier, but the amounts are taking the discounted price. This is year one. Right. Hope it is clear. It's a kind of pretty straightforward exercise. Hope you all are getting that. So you have that particular exercise done over here. So total discount 20,000 and you have allocated that on the proportionate allocation and then you take the consideration. Now let's move on to the final step of the 5-step model. What is that? Recognize revenue when the entity satisfies a performance obligation. So it is in fact, I have mentioned earlier, but here also further emphasize that the final step, you need to recognize the revenue when the seller satisfies a performance obligation by transferring a promised good or service to a customer. So how do you satisfy the performance obligation? Once you transfer the kind of technical support should be divided for here also technical support. Is that technical support we have divided no? In the previous example. Here in the answer what you would see over here, that's what your question. Yes. So here they haven't taken that up to the kind of journal entry. They have just allocated the kind of discount among the performance obligation and taken the price, and thereafter you need to recognize the revenue. Here it hasn't gone up to that extent because earlier also we have discussed something similar to that, right? So that's the reconciliation. Good. මෙතන උතාලා ක්වෙස්චන් කරන්නේ මේ 25000 මෙතනම තියෙන්නේ නැතුව ඒක දෙකට බෙදලා යන්න ඕනේ කියන එක. නමුත් මෙතන අර ජර්නල් එන්ට්‍රීස් නෙමෙයි රෙවෙනියු එක රිකග්නයිස් කරන එක නෙමෙයි කියලා තියෙන්නේ. මේ මුලින්ම ඩිස්කවුන්ට් එක ඇලොකේට් කරලා කන්සිඩරේෂන් එක අරන් තියෙන්නේ. එතකොට මේ කන්සිඩරේෂන් එක තමයි අපි ඩිවයිඩ් කරන්නේ performance obligation වලට. එතන ටෙක්නිකල් සපෝට් එක අවුරුදු දෙකක නිසා ඒක 12500 ගානේ යන්න ඕනේ. ඒක අපි කන්සිඩර් කරා, right? Good. Let's come to the 5th step. You need to recognize the revenue when the seller satisfies the performance obligation by transferring a promised goods or service to a customer. So you must you must consider the performance obligation as satisfied. So once you transfer the promised goods or service to a customer. Seller satisfies the performance obligation when the customer obtains the control of that goods or services. And what is the point that you consider that you have transferred the promised goods or service to the customer? That is the point where the customer obtains the control of the goods or service. So that is the point where the revenue must be recognized. If you look at that, considering the previous example, once the customer take the control of the software license, you consider that you have delivered the performance obligation. Once you deliver the installation service, once the customer get the service, the control of that particular service, and that is the point where you consider the revenue is recognized. Likewise, the control of an asset means having the ability to direct the use of and obtain substantially all of the remaining benefits from the asset. So generally, what do you mean by contract? If you have the contract, you have the ability to direct the use of that particular asset, right? When it comes to a kind of particular asset, you can direct the use of that. So in fact that I have mentioned that when we are discussing about the leases as well. So how do you distinguish a service contract from a lease contract? In the lease contract, what you have the control over a specific asset. In that, you can direct the use of that particular asset. So here also the same context, same meaning is taken. So you can direct the use of a particular asset. So if you purchase a particular software license and you are the one who decide how you are going to use it. It's not someone else. You have the say over the software license what you have purchased, and obtain substantially all of the remaining benefit from the asset. And you can enjoy the benefits for the remaining lifetime of that particular asset. In the case of sale of goods, the performance obligation may be satisfied at a point in time. So, usually when it comes to a particular good, so it is satisfied at a particular point in time. There's nothing called satisfying performance obligation over time. It's the case for the services. එතකොට services වල තමයි තියෙන්නේ performance obligation එකක් කාලයක් තිස්සේ satisfy කිරීම. නමුත් අපි ගත්තොත් භාණ්ඩයක තියෙන්නේ යම්කිසි නිශ්චිත අවස්ථාවක තමයි performance obligation එක satisfy කරන්නේ. basic example එක dockyard plc එක ship එකක් deliver කරන්න ඕනේ ශ්‍රී ලංකා navy එකට. එතකොට ඕක යම්කිසි point එකක සිද්ධ වෙනවා. delivery එක යම්කිසි point එකක තමයි සිද්ධ වෙන්නේ. කාලච්ඡේදයක් පුරාවට භාණ්ඩය ලබා දීමක් වෙන්නේ නැහැ. ඒක nature of the good. It's a point in time. But when it comes to a service, the performance obligation may be satisfied over a period of time. If it takes the technical support, it is performed over 2 years' time, right? It's something like that. The factors which may indicate that the control is passed at a point in time include the entity has a present right to receive the payment for the asset. So the point where the kind of point where the seller get the kind of right to receive the payment for the asset. Then we can consider the control is passed to the customer. The entity has transferred the legal title of the asset, obviously. So most of the cases you may transfer the legal title. The business may transfer the legal title to the customer. The entity has transferred the physical possession. So physically, possession has been transferred. The customer has significant risk and rewards related to the ownership of the asset. Now, the customer is the one who enjoys the reward and is the one who incurs the risk. The customer has accepted the asset. So these are some very kind of general things that would indicate that the customer has obtained the control. Pretty straightforward facts. In case of services, the performance obligation is satisfied when the service is performed. So that is the case for services. However, when the service is long-term, the performance obligation is satisfied over time. As I mentioned, if it is a performance, it's a service, the performance obligation is satisfied over time by selecting an appropriate method for measuring the entity's progress. By selecting an appropriate method for measuring the entity's progress. Earlier, we saw that the technical support is provided over 2 years' time. If the technical support is provided over 2 years' time, you need to consider a reasonable basis to recognize the revenue. In that, what was the reasonable basis that we have considered? The services what they perform would be of equal importance, and depending on that, we used to recognize the technical support income on a straight line basis. But අපි service income එක recognize කරන්න ඕනේ යම්කිසි reasonable basis එකකට. එතකොට අපි කලින් අවස්ථාවේ කොහොමද technical service වල revenue එක recognize කරේ straight line basis එකකට. එතකොට අපි හිතුවා මේ perform කරන services equal important කියලා. එහෙමනම් ඒ basis එකකින් අපි straight line basis එකට තමයි ගත්තේ. ඒකයි අපි 12500 ගානේ ගත්තේ. But there can be other methods that is reasonable, especially when it comes to the construction contract. When you come to the construction contract, you need to decide at the end of each reporting period how much of the work is certified, how much of the work is performed. Let's say that at the end of the first year, 30% of the work is performed. Of the total contract, total construction, 30% of the contract construction is completed. So therefore, then out of the total revenue, you are eligible to recognize 30% of that. Similarly, by the end of the second year, you have completed 70% of the kind of contract. 70% of the construction is done and it is certified. So if so, the second year, in the first year you recognize 30%, the remaining 40% must be recognized in the second year. Likewise, by referring to the work that you have completed by the reporting date, you should recognize the revenue. So it's about the contract, the revenue from contract with customers. That is about the 5-step model. It's about the revenue aspect. It's about the revenue aspect, right? So මේ දක්වා අපි කතා කරේ 5-step model එක අපිට ලොකු කාලයක් ගත්තා. නමුත් ඒක වටිනවා අලුත් ස්ටෑන්ඩඩ් එකක් සහ comprehensive understanding එකක් තිබීම ගොඩක් වැදගත් වෙනවා. එතකොට අපි දැන් දන්නවා කොහොමද 5-step model එකට අනුව revenue එක recognize කරන්න කියලා. ඒත් එකම අපි දන්නවා මේ යම්කිසි revenue එකක් generate කරනකොට ව්‍යාපාරයට cost එකක් තියෙනවා. ඒක අපි cost of sales කියලා අඳුර ගන්නවා. ඒකට අපි භාණ්ඩ විකුණන ව්‍යාපාරයක නම් straightforward, there you experience the cost of the goods that you sold, that is the cost of the contract. එතකොට මේ ස්ටෑන්ඩඩ් එකේ ඊට පස්සේ කතා කරනවා මේ cost එක ගැනත් extensively කතා කරනවා. Right? We'll see what it is now. We call it contract cost. Contract cost. What about the contract cost? As per the standard, the SLFRS 15, they divide the contract cost into two. They call it contract cost. One main component, it's about the incremental cost of obtaining a contract. One part of the cost, they would identify incremental cost of obtaining a contract. And the second thing, it's about the cost to fulfill a contract, right? We'll see what those are. Starting from incremental cost of obtaining a contract. It says that the cost that an entity incurs to obtain a contract that it would not have incurred if the contract had not been successfully obtained, right? The incremental cost, even you have exposed to this, the incremental cost, when you are discussing about the impairment testing, there you have discussed when you are getting the fair value less cost to sell, the cost to sell mean incremental cost. And also the kind of in the fair value standard discussion, you discuss about transaction cost. The transaction cost is also a kind of incremental cost, right? The cost that arise when you transact in a particular market. Those are incremental cost. Likewise, in the context of revenue, you would find that there are certain incremental cost. So that would be the cost that would arise if you obtain a particular contract. You know, it is not about the simple buying and selling of goods, but you may have to decide of a kind of large scale contract, right? Say that the contract for construction of a building, say that even in the university, we are doing lots of construction. So in that, the bidders would have to offer different the bids, and in that, so they would have to consider about this incremental cost. The incremental cost would be the cost that would arise as a matter of accepting the particular contract. The cost that an entity incurs to obtain a contract that it would not have incurred if the contract had not been successfully obtained. So මේ incremental cost එක කියන්නේ contract එකක් අත්පත් කර ගැනීම තුල ඇතිවන cost එකක්. ඒක නිසා අපිට carefully look at කරන්න වෙනවා. උදාහරණයක් විදිහට අපිට කියන්න පුළුවන් sales commission incurred to get the contract. So if you get a particular contract, so you may have to offer a kind of commission. Let's say that in case of insurance, right? When it comes to the insurance businesses, you know, this sales agent, he would be getting the kind of commission once they successfully obtain a particular customer. So if they're successfully able to convince the customer, and if they get the business, then that particular agent would be entitled for a kind of commission. So therefore, from the business point of view, it's a kind of incremental cost. Why they would incur that particular commission? Only because they are obtaining the contract from the customer. And that's a classic example for a kind of contract. That's a kind of a classic example for an incremental cost. The cost that you would have to incur only if the particular contract is obtained. The contract එක අත්පත් කර ගැනීම තුලම ඇතිවන cost එකක්. Then the other part, it's about cost to fulfill a contract. It's about fulfilling a contract. If you think about a kind of manufacturing a particular product and selling that, in that particular instance, you would have to have the direct labor, the direct material, the direct other expenses, and also the overheads. Those has to be there. The costs that are explicitly chargeable to the customer under the contract, the other costs that are incurred only because an entity is entered into the contract. Likewise, directly attributable cost is what we call the cost of fulfilling a contract. So therefore, two aspects when come to the contract cost, you need to consider about incremental cost and cost to fulfill the contract. We'll see how we are going to treat each of these. It says that when it comes to the incremental cost, if the entity expects to recover the incremental cost of obtaining a contract with a customer, the entity shall recognize those costs as an asset. When it comes to this incremental cost, if you expect to recover that from the customer, simply putting, say that it's a commission or something, if you are going to include that particular commission in the transaction price, that's what we call the recovery of the incremental cost. If you expect to recover the incremental cost, then it says that how you should treat that incremental cost. That incremental cost must be treated as an asset. Further, it says, however, practically, if the amortization period be 1 year or less, the incremental cost of obtaining a contract can be expensed. So, but when it comes to this amortization period, so if you consider that the contract is for 1 year's time, if the contract is for 1 year's time, then there is no point of capitalizing that incremental cost, simply treat it as an expense. That's what it says. But මෙතන කියන්නේ මොකක්ද කාරණාව? අපි කිව්වා incremental cost එකක් කියන්නේ contract එක ලබා ගැනීම හේතුවෙන් අපිට දරන්න වෙන පිරිවැය. කොට උදාහරණයක් අපි ගත්තේ insurance industry එකේ යම්කිසි agent කෙනෙක් successfully customer කෙනෙක්ට sell කරගත්තොත් contract එක අන්න ව්‍යාපාරය entity එකේ කියන agent commission එකක් ගෙවන්න ඕන. එතකොට එතන තියෙන incremental cost එකක්, cost of obtaining the contract. එතකොට කියනවා ඒ කියන incremental cost එක අපිට asset එකක් විදිහට treat කරන්න පුළුවන්. කොහොමද asset එකක් විදිහට treat කරන්නේ? අපි ඔය කියන commission එක include කරනවා නම් customer ගේ ගෙන් අපි charge කරන price එකට. customer ගෙන් අපි charge කරන premium එකට අපි ඔය කියන commission එකත් include කරනවා නම් ඒක අපිට asset එකක් විදිහට recognize කරන්න පුළුවන්. හැබැයි සාමාන්‍යයෙන් ඔය කියන contract එක අවුරුද්දකට නම් පවතින්නේ ඒ වගේ වෙලාවක තේරුමක් නැහැ නේ capitalize කරලා asset එකක් කියන්නේ අවුරුද්දකට වඩා වැඩිපුර benefit යන අවස්ථාවක්. ඒ නිසා incremental cost එකක් උනත් අවුරුද්දක් නම් contract එක තියෙන්නේ අවුරුද්දක් හෝ ඊට වඩා අඩු කාලයක් නම් ඒක අපිට කියනවා simply expense කරන්න කියලා. You need to simply expense that. Otherwise, you can include it as a part of the kind of contract. So, it should be something that you should recognize as a kind of asset, and that must be treated as a kind of asset and amortize over the period. Amortize it over the period. Right. Then you have the cost to fulfill a contract. Recognize as an asset only if all of the following criteria are met. It says that when it comes to cost to fulfill a contract, Cost to fulfill a contract, it says that you can recognize it as an asset only if all of the following criteria are met. What is that? The cost relate directly to a contract or to an anticipated contract that the entity can specifically identify. Simply putting, the cost directly relate to a contract. Say, for an example, let's say that you manufacture a particular product and sell that. In that particular case, the direct labor, the direct material, and the other overhead, whatever the things that you would incur, that would be part of the cost of the inventory. When come to the inventory is an asset. So once you sell that inventory, and then only it become an expense. But initially, it's a kind of asset, that is inventory. තොර මුලින්ම අපි පාණ්ඩයක් හදලා විකුණන ව්‍යාපාරයක් ගැන හිතුවොත් අපිට තියෙනවා direct labor, direct material, direct other සහ overhead cost. තොර මේ වගේ එකතුවක් තමයි අපි කියන්නේ inventory cost එක කියලා. තොර ව්‍යාපාරයකට inventory finished goods කියන්නේ asset එකක්. එහෙනම් අපි යන්න ඒක asset එකක් විදිහට capitalize කරා. මොකද මේක cost directly relate to the kind of cost directly relate to the contract. ඒකට ඒක asset එකක් inventory. The cost generate or enhance the resources of the entity that will be used in satisfying performance obligation in the future. The cost generate or enhance resources of the entity. එතකොට මේ පිරිවැය අපි දරන ඒ තුලින් generate කරනවා ව්‍යාපාරයට resource එකක්. So it is again the asset. At the end of the day, it is a kind of asset. So even when it comes to this, it could be something like you may be acquiring a particular kind of machinery item to kind of because of the contract. That is also the case. So මෙතන අපි අර හදන inventory එක විතරක් නෙමෙයි. ඕන අපිට consider කරන්න පුළුවන් සමහර වෙලාවක ඒ product එක හදන්න අපි machinery එකක් අත්පත් කරගන්නවා. ඒතකොට මේ machinery එකත් අපේ asset එකක් වෙනවා. මොකද ඒකත් අපි භාවිතා කරනවා ඔය කියන contract එක fulfill කරන්න. ඒතකොට ඒ තුලින් සිද්ධ වුණෙත් ව්‍යාපාරයට resource එකක් generate වුණා. නැත්නම් ව්‍යාපාරයේ resources enhance වුණා. ඒතකොට ඒකත් අපි asset එකක් විදිහට ගන්න පුළුවන්. The costs are expected to be recovered. ඒතකොට මේ පිරිවැය අපි recover කරන්න බලාපොරොත්තු වෙනවා. ඒතකොට අපි දන්නවා machine එකක් වගේ item එකක් අපි ගත්තා නම් අපි ඒක depreciation කරලා ඒක manufacturing account එකට charge කරනවා. ඒ තුල අපි අවසාන වශයෙන් කරන්නේ product එකකින් අපි ඒක recover කර ගන්නවා. inventory cost එක තියෙනවා. අපි ඒකට profit එකක් තියාගෙන තමයි විකුණන්නේ. එහෙනම් අපි ඒක recover කර ගන්නවා. ඒක තමයි අපි කියන්නේ cost to fulfill a contract. So let's take it through an example, then it would be more convinced. You are getting the context. So without the context, it would be difficult for you to understand this. We may get the context and see that. Let's try the activity 12.8, then you would be more convinced what these incremental costs are and what these the cost to fulfill the contract. We'll see. An IT consulting company brings a competitive bid to provide consulting service for a period of 3 years to a new customer. Right. But අපේ තියෙන IT consultancy company එකක් ඒ company එක bid එකක් win කරලා තියෙනවා අවුරුදු 3කට consultancy service provide කරන යම්කිසි ආයතනයකට. The following costs were incurred by the entity to obtain the contract. In obtaining the contract, you have incurred following cost. External legal fees for due diligence. So you need to perform the due diligence. The feasibility has to be checked. In that, you have incurred 150,000. Legal fees for due diligence. So it is the cost that you have incurred to obtain the contract. The traveling cost to deliver the proposal. So from your business location, you have to travel the premises of the customer and you have submitted the proposal. You have to present your bid. Then commission paid to sales employees. And you have paid the kind of commission you would have agreed. The kind of commission and you would have paid that 300,000. Altogether, you have incurred 300, 250 and 150,000. Further, the company has purchased IT equipment for rupees 120,000. which is to be used only for the consultation of this customer. So you have purchased kind of uh, IT equipment, so which is necessary in satisfying the requirement of the customer. Then it asks, explain the accounting treatment for above cost. You can see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4 cost items are there, and you are supposed to come up with the accounting treatment. හරි. එතකොට අපිට දැන් cost item 4ක් තියෙනවා මෙතන පේනවා මේ contract එකට අදාළව. දැන් අපෙන් අහනවා කොහොමද අපි මේ එක් cost item එක treat කරන්න යන්නේ. What about external legal fees for due diligence? First one, if you think about that, 150,000. Is it an incremental cost? So it is for sure, it is something that you had incurred to obtain the contract. The only thing what you have to question is that whether it's an incremental cost or not. If it is an incremental cost, since the contract is for 3 years, you know that you need to capitalize that, right? That's the point. But අපිට තියෙනවා මෙතන කියලා තියෙනවා පැහැදිලිව මේ contract එක ලබා ගැනීමේදී දරපු පිරිවැය කියලා. but අපිට දැන් අහන්න තියෙන එකම ප්‍රශ්නේ මේ cost incremental cost ද කියන එක. මොකද incremental cost උනොත් අපි දන්නවා එතනදී අපි capitalize කරන්න ඕනේ, capitalize කරලා amortize කරන්න ඕනේ. right? එහෙම නැති වුණොත් just expense. එතකොට අපි බැලුවොත් external legal fees for due diligence. එතකොට කොහොමද අපි demarcate කරගන්නේ යම් කිසි expense එකක් incremental cost එකක් වෙනවද නැද්ද කියන එක. එතකොට ඒකට එකම criteria එක තමයි අපි තීරණය කරන්නේ මේ cost එක සහ contract එක ලබා ගැනීම අතර තියෙන relationship එක. එතකොට සමහර cost තියෙන්න පුළුවන් contract එක ලැබීම හේතුවෙන් ඇති වෙන ඒවා, සමහර cost තියෙන්න පුළුවන් irrespective of the fact that whether you obtain the contract or not, it may exist. Right? සමහර cost තියෙනවා contract එක ලබා ගැනීම තුලම තරන්න වෙන පිරිවැය, සමහර cost තියෙනවා contract එක ලැබෙනවද නැද්ද කියන එක මත depend වෙන්නේ නැහැ. ඒ cost එක කොහොමත් අපි දරන්න ඕනේ. ඒ වගේ දෙයක් තමයි අපි demarcation එක ගන්න. ඒතකොට incremental කියන්නේ contract එක ලැබුණොත් පමණක්ම ඇති වෙන cost. Incremental නොවන cost, just cost of obtaining, ඒක irrespective of the fact that whether you win the contract or not, still the cost is there. It's like that, right? So in that sense, if you consider about legal fees for due diligence, is it something that you can consider as incremental? අපිට ඒක incremental කියලා consider කරන්න පුළුවන්ද? Due diligence එකක් perform කරනවා. ඒකද අපිට fee එකක් ගිහින් තියෙනවා. මේ contract එකේ feasibility එකක් අපි analyze කරනවා. එතකොට ඒක සහ contract එක ලැබීම අතර relationship එකක් තියෙනවනේ. අපි due diligence එක perform කරොත් contract එක ලැබෙනවා. due diligence එක perform කරේ නැත්නම් contract එක ලැබෙන්නේ නැහැ කියලා. එහෙම relationship එකක් නැහැ. contract එක ලැබුණත් නැතත් ඔය කියන විදිහට අපි සාමාන්‍යයෙන් යම් කිසි bid එකක් ලබා ගන්න යනවා නම් due diligence එකක් perform කරනවා. feasibility එකක් අපිට මේක කරන්න පුළුවන් task එකක්ද කියන එක අපි analyze කරගන්නවා. එහෙනම් ඒක contract එක ලැබෙනවද නැද්ද කියන එක නෑ. ඒක සාමාන්‍යයෙන් contract එක ලැබුණත් නැතත් අපි ඒක cost එක incur කරනවා. එහෙනම් පළවෙනි එක ඒ basis එකෙන් අපිට ගන්න පුළුවන් it's not a incremental cost. If it is not an incremental cost, what is the treatment? Immediately expense that. So therefore, the legal fees must be immediately expensed, since it is not incremental. Then what about the travel cost? Travel cost to deliver the proposal. අපි ඒ incur කර travel cost එක තීරණය කරනවාද අපි මේ contract එක ලැබෙනවද නැද්ද කියන එක. නැහැනේ. contract එක ලැබුණත් නැතත් අපි කොහොමද ගිහිල්ලා proposal එක මුලින් බාර දෙන්න මෙපේ. එතකොට proposal එක බාර දෙන cost එක contract එක ලැබීම තුල ඇති වෙන පිරිවැයක් නෙමෙයි. contract එක ලැබුණා නැත්නම් කොහොමත් අපි ගිහිල්ලා ওই proposal එක දෙන්න ඕනේ. අපි හිතමු contract එක ලැබුණ නැහැ කියලා. හැබැයි ඒ cost එක ඒත් තිබිලා. ඒතකොට incremental කියන්නේ contract එක ලැබුණොත් විතරක් තියෙන cost. ඒතකොට අපි ගිහිල්ලා ඔන්න proposal එක submit කරනවා. හැබැයි අපි win කරන්නේ නැහැ. ඒ කියන්නේ cost එක තියෙනවා proposal එක cost එක තියෙනවා contract එක ලැබිලා නැහැ. එහෙනම් travel cost එකත් incremental cost එකක් නෙමෙයි. incremental cost එකක් නෙමෙයි නම් ඒකත් immediately expense. Then third one, commission paid to sales employees. Commission එකක් ඇයි අපි employees ලට pay කරන්නේ? Contract එක ලැබුණොත් විතරයි අපි ඔය කියන commission එක employees ලට pay කරන්නේ. එහෙමනම් commission එක අන්න contract එක ඇතිවීම තුලම ඇති වෙන cost එකක්. ඒක එහෙනම් incremental cost එකක්. Incremental cost එකක් නම් මොකක්ද treatment එක? Capitalize it. Initially capitalize. Since this is for 3 years time, you should amortize that. 300,000, you can charge that to the contract cost on a kind of systematic basis. Let's say that it's a straight line basis. Then per annum, this commission must be taken to your expense. Contract cost, take this 100,000. Right? That is your kind of cost of sales. එක අපේ cost of sale එකක් අපේ contract එකේ cost එකක් contract cost එකක්. Right? Then you have then it's all about the cost of obtaining the contract. Then you have the cost of fulfilling the cost of fulfilling the contract. මේ තමයි contract එක ලබා ගන්න ගියපු cost ටික. දැන් අපි ගාව තියෙනවා fulfill කරන්න යනකොට යන වියදම්. The further, the company has purchased IT equipment for 120,000, which it is to be used only for the consultation of this customer. So, මේ customer consultation services provide කිරීමේදීම අවශ්‍ය වෙන equipment එකක් තියෙනවා. එතන enhance වීමක් තියෙනවා resources. It is captured by the second point and it will be recovered from the customer. You would charge the price which covering this value of this IT equipment. Again, it's a kind of asset because it is expected to be used over a period of 3 years. So therefore, this can be treated as asset. And so therefore, you should consider the depreciation to your expense. So therefore, initially capitalize 120,000, then on a reasonable basis, depreciate that. And on an annual basis, you can recognize part of that as the contract cost. ඔන්න අපිට 120න් කොටසක් අඳුර ගන්න පුළුවන් සෑම අවුරුද්දෙම අපි හිතමු මේකත් ස්ප්‍රෙඩ් ලයින් කියලා. ඒතකොට සෑම අවුරුද්දකම එකම ලෙවල් එකේ සර්විස් එකක් ප්‍රොවයිඩ් කරනවා කියලා. එහෙනම් 40,000 ගානේ අවුරුදු 3ට contract cost එක කියලා අඳුර ගන්න පුළුවන්. ඒතකොට කමිෂන් එකෙන් ලක්ෂ ගානේ ආවා. මෙතනින් 40,000 ගානේ ආවා. ඒතකොට contract cost එක අවුරුද්දකට අපිට පේනවා 1,40,000 ගානේ තියෙනවා. ඒතකොට අපි ඒක කන්සිඩර් කරලා අපි profit එකක් තියාගෙන යම්කිසි ගාණක් අය කරේ. අපි හිතමු 200,000 annum එකකට එන්න අපි මේ contract එකට ලක්ෂ 6ක් අය කරනවා කියලා. So that may be the case. It is not the case, but maybe 300,000 per annum, let's say 900,000 they would charge. ඉතින් ලක්ෂ 9ක් charge කරා කියලා. ඒතර එහෙනම් අවුරුද්දකට ලක්ෂ 3 ගානේ contract revenue එක විදිහට අඳුනගෙන යයි. That is the story. Does that make sense? So you can even look at the kind of answer that is given. The external legal fees for due diligence, 150,000, what you need to do? Expense. The second one, traveling cost, expense. Why is that? The legal fees and traveling costs would have been incurred whether the bid was won or not. That's the point you need to understand. Irrespective of the fact that whether you win this bid or not, you have to come across these expenses. Therefore, those costs are recognized as expenses. So therefore, it is not incremental. The cost is incremental only if that particular cost exists, if the contract is there. Otherwise, that cost can't be the case. So like commission, the commission would only be there only if you win the contract. The entity recognized an asset for 300,000, the commission asset, incremental cost of obtaining contract, because the entity expect to recover those costs through the future fees from consultancy services. Then on an annual basis, you need to amortize that. That is to the kind of contract cost. You should recognize If it is on a straight line basis, 100,000. Then you have the cost to fulfill 120,000. Yes, it's a kind of asset. The cost relate directly to a contract or to an anticipated contract. The cost generate the enhanced resources. The costs are expected to be recovered. So those are the three simple points what it is made over here. So that's the story. ඒක පැහැදිලිද පුතාලා ප්‍රශ්න තියෙනවා and I can further explain it. The confusion that you may have. So you need to understand that with the logic. And if you get it with the logic, that's it. See whether it makes sense. ඒක පැහැදිලිද කියලා බලන්න. Yes. Ready for feedback? Are you getting that or not? Anything that you are not comfortable with? Or anything that you are not clear? පැහැදිලි නැති දෙයක් තියෙනවා නම් කියන්න. ඒක explain කරන්න පුළුවන්. Clear. Okay, good. Let's move on. तर මෙතන කතාව තමයි සමහර ඒවා අපි expense කරනවා immediately, සමහර ඒවා assets විදියට අඳුනගෙන amortize කරනවා. නැත්නම් depreciate කරනවා. ඒතකොට ඒ වගේ අවස්ථාවේ ඒක අපි contract cost එකක් කියලා තමයි කියන්නේ. contract cost එකක් වෙන්නේ මෙතන කිව්වා contract cost එකක් කියන definition එකට වැටෙන්නේ incremental cost සහ cost to fulfill. එතකොට මේ කියන question එකේ එමනම් contract cost එක වෙන්නේ මේ commission එකයි ඒක incremental cost එකක් මෙතන තියෙනවා cost to fulfill the contract. නම් මේ දෙක තමයි contract cost එක කියලා අපි ගන්න. අනිත් ඒවා just expenses, charge them to the P&L immediately. P&L එකට ටක් ගාලා charge කරනවා. මේවා initially asset එකක් විදිහට අඳුනගෙන annual basis එකේ යම්කිසි අගයක් තමයි contract cost කියලා ගන්නෙ revenue එකට against. revenue එක ගත්තා ඒකට against ගත්ත cost එක. ඒ අනුව තමයි gross profit work out කරලා අපි යන්නේ. Right. Presentation. The present the performance obligation of a contract in the statement of financial position as a contract asset or a contract liability. Right? When it comes to the kind of performance, the performance of a contract in the statement of financial position, you may have to either recognize a contract asset or a contract liability, depending on the relationship between the entity's performance and the customer's payment. What are the instances where you get the contract asset? And what are the instances that you get the contract liability? Let's see. The contract asset, an entity's right to consideration in exchange for goods or service that the entity has transferred to customer when that right is conditioned on something other than passage of time. What is that? It says that if you have a conditional right, to the consideration, and that is a contract asset. Let me give an example for that. Let's say that there is a particular contract, right? So as per the contract, there are two performance obligations, right? When it comes to the kind of payment, the terms of the contract says that the customer would pay the price of the contract only after the business or the entity perform all the performance obligation, right? The contract says that, so let's say that there is a contract where they have two performance obligation. Let's say two performance obligation are there, and the contract is specified that the customer would settle the price of the contract after the fulfillment of all the performance obligation. Contract එකක් තියෙනවා performance obligation දෙකයි තියෙන්නේ. Customer අපිට price එක ගෙවන්නේ කොහොමද? මේ performance obligation දෙකම satisfy වුණාට පස්සේ. Right? So when it comes to the contract price, let's say it is 100,000. And the value of standalone price of the first performance obligation, let's say 60,000. Second one, let's say 40,000. The performance obligation දෙකේ වටිනාකම පළවෙනි performance obligation එක 60,000ක් වටිනවා. දෙවෙනි performance obligation එකේ standalone price එක අපි හිතමු 40,000. අපි හිතමු it's a software license and installation service කියලා. software license එක software license සහ technical support කියලා අපි හිතමු. software license එක 60,000යි, technical support එක අවුරුද්දකට 40,000. तर customer කියනවා customer agree වෙලා තියෙන්නේ ඔය කියන performance obligation දෙකම satisfy කරාට පස්සේ තමයි මම සල්ලි ගෙවන්නේ. නමුත් අපි දන්නවා revenue එක recognize කරන්නේ කොහොමද? At the completion of each performance obligation. අපි දන්නවා revenue එක recognize කරන්නේ each performance obligation එක satisfy වුණාට පස්සේ. ඒකට පළවෙනි එකේ අපිට ඔන්න immediately after delivering the software license you have satisfied the first performance obligation. तर software එක deliver කරපුවම ඔන්න පළවෙනි performance obligation එක satisfy කරලා ඉවරයි. ඒකට එතනදී යන්න අපිට revenue එකට අපි entitled එන revenue එක recognize කරා 60,000. දැන් අපේ debit entry එක. credit entry එක revenue එකට 60,000 දැම්මා. debit entry එක කොහෙටද දාන්නේ? සාමාන්‍යයෙන් නම් ණයට විකිණීමක් නම් එතන trade receivable කියලා දාන්න පුළුවන්. ඒක තමයි සාමාන්‍යයෙන් අපි කරන්නේ. මොකද අපිට සල්ලි අනාගතේනේ හම්බෙන්නේ. හැබැයි මෙතන අනාගතේ මුදල් හම්බෙනවටත් වඩා අනාගතේ මුදල් හම්බෙනවා හැබැයි තව කන්ඩිෂන් එකකුත් තියෙනවා. මොකක්ද? කස්ටමර් කියනවා මම ගෙවන්නේ ඔයා දෙවෙනි performance obligation එක satisfy කර. ඔයා technical support එකත් දීලා ඉවර වුණාට පස්සේ තමයි මම ඔයාට ගෙවන්නේ. එහෙනම් එතන receivable amount එකක් තියෙනවා. ඔව්. හැබැයි ඒක conditional වෙලා. You need to satisfy the second performance obligation in order to eligible for that. So therefore, you can't take the debit entry to trade receivable. Instead, it has to be the contract asset. That's what we call the contract asset. So therefore, revenue 60,000 credit, 60,000 debit to the contract asset. Right? Then what is the difference between the trade receivable and contract asset? The trade receivable represents that it's a unconditional right. If there is no condition as such, and that is where you take to the trade receivable. To consideration shall be presented separately as a receivable. So therefore, presenting something as trade receivable and contract asset, there is a difference. එතකොට මේක receivable තමයි හැබැයි මේ දෙකේ පොඩි වෙනසක් තියෙනවා. මොකක්ද? contract asset එකේ අපිට තියෙන්නේ conditional right එකක් for the consideration. හැබැයි trade receivable කියන්නේ unconditional right එකකට. නම් ඒක අපි තේරුම් ගන්න ඕන. Then what about the contract liability? It is pretty straightforward. Contract liability, it is a kind of prepaid amount. So if the customer has paid the amount in advance, so you would get that the cash gets debit, the prepaid revenue. Prepaid revenue in the sense contract liability. You can take it as a contract liability. The contract liability is an entity's obligation to transfer goods or service to a customer for which the entity has received consideration. The amount due from customer from the customer. The consideration received from customer. You have already received the consideration, so therefore you have obligation to transfer the goods or service. So it is simply putting prepaid revenue. Prepaid revenue is a contract liability. There's no problem even if you are saying for that prepaid revenue contract liability, if you had said that, that is totally fine. Still you can use the term prepaid revenue. So after prepaid revenue එකට prepaid revenue කියලා කියන්න පුළුවන්. එහෙම නැත්නම් contract liability කියලා කිව්වත් ප්‍රශ්නයක් නෑ. ඒතර තියෙන්නේ contract liability. The contract liability is generally referred as unearned sales revenue, unearned service revenue, or another appropriate account title. ඒතර අපිට ඒකට කැමති නමක් දෙන්න පුළුවන්. සාමාන්‍යයෙන් කියනවලු unearned sales revenue කියලා කියනවලු unearned service revenue කියලා කියනවා. Different terms, right? So අපි prepaid revenue කිව්වත් කමන්නේ මොකද අපි කියනනේ another appropriate account title එකක් උනත් දෙන්න පුළුවන් කියලා. Yeah, that must be the case. Right, let's put it through an example, then it would be more convinced. Okay, so just a couple of slides. Give it a try. Read the question and see. On 1st of January 2020, the Fine PLC enters into a contract to transfer product A and B to Dev Private Limited for rupees 100,000. ලක්ෂයකට product දෙකක් transfer කරන contract එකකට enter වුණාලු ජනවාරි 1 වෙනිදා. The contract specifies that payment of product A will not take place until product B is delivered. Product B එක deliver කරනකම් A එකට ගෙවන්නේ නැහැ කියලා ඔන්න contract එකේ සඳහන් වෙනවා. The fine PLC determines that the standalone prices are 30,000 for product A, 70,000 for product B. Product A එකට 30,000යි, product B එකට 70,000යි කියලා standalone prices හොයාගෙන තියෙනවා. එතකොට consideration එකත් 100,000 ඒක discount මොකුත් නැහැ. ඒක product දෙක අතර බෙදලා ගිහිලා තියෙනවා. Fine PLC delivers the product A to Dev Private Limited on 1st of February 2020. February 1 වෙනිදා ඔන්න පළවෙනි product එක deliver කරාලු. එහෙනම් අපි දන්නවා මේ point එකේ අපිට revenue එක recognize කරන්න පුළුවන් නේද? So because we agreed that when it comes to a product, the performance obligation is satisfied in a particular point in time, and this is a point where you satisfy the performance obligation. So therefore, you are entitled for the revenue. So therefore, you can get the revenue credit 30,000. Then what about the debit entry? 30,000. Debit entry. Is it trade receivable or is it contract asset? What kind of right that you have? Right for the consideration. You have a right for the consideration, but it is a kind of conditional. Because only if you deliver the product B, you are entitled for the kind of revenue. So therefore, debit entry goes to the contract asset. On 1st of March 2020, the Fine PLC delivered the product B. After 1 month's time, you have delivered the product B. So now you have fulfilled that. You are eligible to recognize the revenue for the second product. So the revenue gets credit 70,000. Then what about the debit entry? Now your conditional right is over. Now it's just an unconditional right. So therefore, debit entry, trade receivables 100,000. The 30,000 what you had recognized earlier in the contract asset must get credit now. It's like this. See, on 1st of February, contract asset debit 30,000, revenue credit 30,000. On March 1st, where you deliver the second product, you entitled to recognize the revenue 70,000 at that point, and the contract asset gets credit. The entire amount is taken to the trade receivable. See whether it is clear. This is how the accounting would take place. මේ විදිහට තමයි accounting සිද්ධ වෙන්න ඕන. පැහැදිලිද බලන්න? On 1st of February, you have conditional right. That's why you have put that 30,000 to the contract asset. But the 1st of March, you have delivered the second product. So therefore, your conditional right become unconditional right. So therefore, 30,000 credit to the contract asset and 30,000 debit to the account receivable. Here you have revenue 70,000 from the second product. There also comes 70,000 to here. Altogether, it becomes 100,000. Is that clear? Yes, let's see. So can we write a third entry to record the receipt of cash? Yes, definitely, because the question says that it doesn't talk about the receipt of cash. So in a later point in time, you might receive that. So they haven't mentioned when the kind of payment would be taken place. So if the question had mentioned that the payment is taken place on 1st of March, yes, you would recognize on that date. But if it is at a later point in time, yes, definitely you can take the cash debit 100,000 credit account receivable. That's how it goes. Yes, very correct. So can you explain the previous slide again? Okay, because they promised to pay when the second good is delivered. Yes. So initially you have taken that. Your point, I'm getting that. So here, what you suggest that why can't it be cash? Yes, even it can be cash. if it has been made the payment on that particular date, it can be entirely cash. එතකොට පුතාලා සජෙස්ට් කරන විදිහට මේක ඊ දවසේම payment එක කරා නම් cash වලට ගන්න තිබ්බා. ඒකට අපි මෙතන හිතලා තියෙන්නේ payment එක එදාම සිද්ධ වෙලා නැතුව ඇති කියන්නේ. ඒකයි account receivable වලට අරගෙන තියෙන්නේ. So expectation එක අපි තිබ්බේ පෙන්නන්න contract asset එක සහ trade receivable අතර වෙනස. ඒ නිසා අපි මෙතන ගන්න තියෙන්නේ ඇත්තට yes අර කියන එකේ point එකක් තියෙනවා. ඒකට question එක more realistic වෙන්න අපි ගමු customer make the payment on 10th of March කියලා. ඒකට චුට්ටක් මේක ගොඩක් පැහැදිලි right? Customer made the settlement on 10th of March 2020. Good. අපි හිතමු customer settlement එක කරේ 10 වෙනිදා කියලා. එතකොට අපිට අර ස්ටෝරි එක හොඳට පැහැදිලි වෙනවා. contract asset එක transfer වුණා trade account receivable වලට ඊට පස්සේ ඔන්න settlement එක සිද්ධ වෙනවා. Now I believe it is complete, right? Okay. Yes, it says that it is not clear the slide. So pretty simple stories there. පොඩි කාරණාවයි තිබ්බේ. ඒක තමයි අපි contract asset එක සහ trade receivable එක distinguish කරගන්න උත්සාහ කරේ. So when it comes to the contract asset, it's kind of receivable, but the right what you have, it's a conditional right. So for an example, here you can see that as per the contract, you have agreed to provide two goods, product A and product B. And the contract says that the payment for product A will take place once you deliver the product B. Or it says that contract specifies that payment of product A will not take place until product B is delivered. Product B එක deliver කරනකම් A එකට payment එක කරන්නේ නැහැ. එතකොට අපිට තියෙන මොන වගේ right එකක්ද? ඒක conditional right එකක් නේ. So once you satisfy the performance obligation, you know that you can recognize the revenue. That's what we've been discussing. So accordingly, you can see that this 30,000, you can recognize that soon after delivering that product. It says that the Fine PLC delivered the product A to Due PLC Private Limited on 1st of February 2020. So therefore, you have delivered the good on that particular date, 1st of February. So consequently, you can recognize the revenue 30,000 on that day. So it's clear credit entry goes to the revenue. Then how about the debit entry? When it comes to the debit entry, if it is on credit, it goes to the trade receivable. But here, you have a right for the consideration. It's a kind of trade receivable, but that particular right is conditioned on the delivery of product B. So therefore, you cannot take it to the trade receivable. Instead, you should take that to the contract asset. The contract asset represents a conditional right. So therefore, take that to the contract asset. And once you deliver the second product, you are eligible to recognize the revenue of that. That was on 1st of March. So you recognize 70,000 to the revenue. Then what you do, you can take that to the account receivable because no problem, no condition is there because you have satisfied the only condition. So accordingly, the 30,000 what you had recognized earlier in the contract asset can now be transferred to the account receivable or the trade receivable. So altogether, 30,000 and 70,000, 100,000 would be there in the trade receivable account. Debit 100,000, 70,000 credit, 30,000 credit to the contract asset. Then on 10th of March, if the customer settles the money, cash debit 100,000, credit account receivable. Right? That's how it goes. Hope that is clear to you. Finally, the disclosures. The entity shall disclose the qualitative and quantitative information for all of the following. The contract with customers, you need to make some quantitative and qualitative presentations. What these are? These disclosures include the disaggregation of revenue into appropriate categories. You know, when it comes to revenue of a particular entity, it may come in different sources. So when it comes to the statement of profit or loss and other comprehensive income, you may present one figure as revenue, but you may give a kind of note. In the note, you need to show that separate categories of revenue. So you have seen earlier revenue from software license, revenue from installation, revenue from technical support. Likewise, there would be different categories of revenue. So therefore, you are supposed to present that in the note. Presentation of opening and closing balances of contract asset and contract liabilities. You can have contract asset at the beginning of the period, at the end of the period. Those has to be presented. And also you can have some prepaid revenue, unearned revenues. So that is contract liability, that should also be shown. And also the significant information relating to their performance obligation, relating to this contract asset, what are the performance obligation, contract liabilities, what are the performance obligations. Significant information may have to be disclosed. And also the significant judgments. These disclosures include judgment and changes in this judgment that affect the determination of the transaction price, the allocation of transaction price, and the determination of the timing of revenue. This is one example for this, that in case that where you have a kind of variable consideration, you might have to make certain judgment. You have to make certain estimates. In that, you would have to say, so on what basis that you make this particular estimate, right? So likewise, your judgment has to be presented. And also, in some instances, when it comes to the kind of contract, you need to divide the contract price among the performance obligation. So when you are dividing that, you may not find the standalone prices for the separate performance obligation. In that, you may have to apply your judgment and do that. So this is something what we had discussed today. So the point what I'm making here, this is it. This is what I'm referring. If a standalone selling price is not directly observable, an entity will need to estimate that. So if there is estimate, your judgment is involved. So that some sort of things as such. සමහර වෙලාවල් වලට අපි contract එකේ තියෙන price එක separate performance obligation වලට බෙදා ගන්න ගියාම අපිට පේනවා standalone prices නැහැ කියලා. Standalone price නැත්නම් අපිට අපේ judgment එක use කරලා තමයි ඒක බෙදා ගන්න වෙන්නේ. එහෙම දේවල් කරා නම් ඒ මොනවද කියන එක disclose කරන්න. Asset recognized from the cost of obtaining or fulfilling a contract. So when you are obtaining a contract, that is in the sense incremental cost and also the fulfilling the contract, what those costs are. You need to disclose those information. The asset recognized in obtaining or fulfilling the contract, amortization, as I suggest, you need to amortize that over the contract period, and the method used for amortization, whether it's straight line basis or it is something other basis. And that's about the disclosures what you need. So with that, we finish the lecture on accounting for revenue, and for your examination up to this would be tested. විභාගෙදී මේ දක්වා ප්‍රමාණය තමයි ටෙස්ට් කරන්නේ. තව පාඩමක් අපේ තිබුණා consolidated financial statements, අපි ඒක ඩිස්කස් කරේ නැහැ. ඒ නිසා පුතාලට ඒක ටෙස්ට් කරන්නේ නැහැ. Right? So now I would like to give you a kind of idea, as I promised from the very beginning, that to present you with the structure of your examination. Structure present karanna, how you are going to get assessed. I believe that this may also be uploaded. මම හිතනවා මේක upload කරයි කියලා, but whether it's uploaded or not. So this is it. So this is your test plan. This is how you are going to get assessed in your final exam. How it goes? Final exam paper consists of two parts. It goes like part 1 and part 2. We couldn't have a kind of midterm test to you, so therefore we thought of taking some questions, MCQ questions from chapter 1 to chapter 7. It is for 30 minutes. For 30 minutes, you expect to perform 15 MCQs, and that will carry a kind of mark. And when it comes to the part 2, so there would be five questions, each carry 20 marks. and that is for the remaining 2.5. So therefore, necessarily here what happens is that the first part would be considered as your midterm test. පෙරපුතාල part දෙකක් යනවා විනාඩි 30ක MCQs 15කුයි පැය දෙකමාරක question 5කුයි යන්නේ. එතකොට MCQ 15 අපි consider කරනවා පුතාලගේ midterm test එක කියලා. එහෙනම් මේ midterm test එකට allocate කරපු මම දැන් 20 marks if I'm not mistaken ඒ 20 mark එක 10 mark එක ලබා දෙන්නේ මේ MCQs base කරලා. ඊට පස්සේ final exam එක එතන තියෙනවා ප්‍රශ්න පහක් එකකට ලකුණු 20යි. එහෙනම් පැය දෙකමාරකින් තමයි කරන්න වෙන්නේ. මොකද ඔක්කොම පේපර් එකටම allocate කරන්නේ පැය 3යිනේ. එතකොට ලකුණු 100ෙන් දෙනවා. 100ෙන් දීලා අපි continuous assessment වලට ඒක අයින් කරලා continuous assessment වලට ඒක අයින් කරලා ඊටු ලකුණු ප්‍රමාණය තමයි final එකට ලබා දෙන්නේ. This question, what is that? Can we practice a sample part 2 questions similar to what we will get at an exam? Yes, probably you would be uploaded a kind of past paper together with the answer. Yes, so that particular concern is addressed. We are going to upload the past paper together with the answer. So then you can have a kind of idea about the part 2 structure. Yes, online quizzes would also be considered in your marks. So you had, if I'm not mistaken, like 6 online quizzes or something. So there would be some marks for the online quizzes, and the mid-term is there, and rest for the kind of final exam. Then when it comes to the second part, so you can see that up to the midterm test from chapter 1 to 7 now, chapter not the entire syllabus. When it comes to the MCQ, it is from chapter 1 to 7, but for the part 2 it comprises the whole thing. And this is how the 100 mark would be consist of. You would be tested on conceptual framework for 10 marks, presentation of financial statements 20 mark, the accounting for liability 10, accounting for assets 10, PPE 10, investment property 5, borrowing cost 5, impairment 10, accounting for leases 10, accounting for revenue 10. And this is how the individual marks would comprises of. Now you have a complete idea on that. Right? එතකොට මම හිතන්නේ පුතාලා final exam එකට කොහොම ලකුණු 70ක් වගේ තමයි allocate වෙන්නේ. information එක මට හරියටම clear කරගන්න බැරි වුණා. ලකුණු 70ක් වගේ තමයි final exam එකට එන්නේ. ලකුණු 100ෙන් දීලා මේක 70කට convert කරන්නේ. එතකොට MCQs වලට මම හිතලා ලකුණු 20ක් යයි එතන. ඒ වගේම online quizzes වලට තව ලකුණු 10ක් යයි. එතකොට ලකුණු 30ක් continuous assessments වලට යනවා. 70ක් final එකට යනවා. එතකොට අපි mid එකක් තියන්නේ final එකේමයි. පැය 3ක paper එකක් මුල් විනාඩි 30 allocate කරගන්න MCQs වලට ඉතුරු විනාඩි ඉතුරු පැය දෙකමාර ඒක allocate කරගන්න final paper එකට. So this is a structure, and also the past paper together with the answers would be uploaded, and that's all for the course. And also the video recordings are uploaded, so you can refer to that. So you know that it's a kind of tough time. So it's not just for you, but for us as well. So we had to do several sacrifices, especially when it come to that. I can remember, so I'm the one who delivered that the conceptual framework online lecture, but in that it didn't work. So thereafter, on the very next day, I had to do a kind of recording on that. It took me kind of days to deliver that particular lecture. So likewise, there was significant time commitment is there. And also that we understand that being the first year students, you may not be that much of familiar with the online mode of teaching, but can't help, that is the environment. Even we do not prefer to go in the kind of online mode, but this seems to be the only alternative that the environment would offer us. So therefore, in this tough time, the challenging period, so somehow we managed to deliver the kind of content what we have expected. Even, you know, the so-called developed countries has also struggled during that time period. So even when it comes to the UK, when it comes to even the other kind of developed context. So they have also accepted that the education being damaged, right? Uh, Education got hit badly because of this COVID pandemic. But still, we believe that we managed to somehow deliver a kind of expected content. And also, thank you very much for your participation. You were there, and you were the only motivation that. Here out of the 160, so ultimately we have like 12 or 13 students. So it's some kind of worries there in that respect. So despite the attempts what we make to deliver the content, the absence is your presence is not at a kind of acceptable level. So there's a kind of worry in that aspect, but somehow, so I can be pleased at the end of the day because we have managed to deliver the content to the best of our capabilities. So in that sense, uh, we are fine with that. Yes, there's a question that will the university be able to commence the exams on 16? I think considering the present environment, no. So I believe that the university won't be able to, because the situation is getting bad and bad, right? It's getting worse. So therefore, I believe it may not be the case, but whatever the decisions that the university would take, that would be communicated to you in um advance, and also in due course, you would be communicated. So therefore, at the moment, I do not have an uh, idea, but depending on the environment, I can say that yes, there's a kind of high probability the university may not be open until even by 16th. That may not be the case. Even if that happens, your exam can be postponed, because it seems that we cannot take you to the university in this present environment physically. So therefore, I believe there can be a kind of postponement of the examinations. Right. Okay. Then. So that's all from our end. Then let me take this opportunity to wish you all the very best for your upcoming exams. So do your work to the best of your capabilities. Never compromise. Make sure that you would have the kind of targets with you. So you want to complete this degree with the kind of first class or second upper. So in that particular case, the university is not going to compromise on that. So it is still expect you to maintain the relevant GPA. It is still expect you to maintain the minimum number of A passes. So the university is not going to change their policies. They are not going to compromise. So therefore, it is something up to you not to compromise and do your work to the best of your capabilities, right? Then wish you all the very best. Thank you very much. And this is going to be our final lecture, because the Friday is going to be a holiday. We don't have lectures on that. Right. With that note, let me conclude the session. Thank you.